as you can see, I've got the engine about back in place. It's not perfect yet, but I've got it on the jack, obviously, and got it brought up in the general position. It's close. I've remounted the coil, of course, up inside here. I reconnected the coil to the wires coming up from the ignition stator down on the left side. You can see the new coil wire right there, high tension lead, and that union is tucked away up inside of the frame here. So I think that's pretty well ready to go. One thing I did want to share with you, these are the two bolts, motor mount bolts that I originally pulled out. This one right here with this nut that's formed into the bolt itself, that's all one piece. That is not a separate nut, that was made that way. This goes through like this from the left to the right, because this is part of the mounting for the air cleaner housing. What I really want to talk about was the bottom motor mount bolt, and that's what this is right here. This also originally, when I took it apart, came through from the left to the right. However, looking at the Honda parts diagrams, this depicts this bolt going from the right to the left, and this would be the bottom bolt right down in here. Since the parts diagrams depict this going from the left to the right, such as this, with the nut on the left side of the bike, that's how I'm going to reinstall it. I suspect, as I shared before, that this motor has been out of the bike before. In fact, I bet on it because of that stator wire that had been repaired. And in order to really do that well, I think they pulled the motor out. And when they put it back together, they put the bolts, the bottom bolt in incorrectly. They put them both in through from the left side, which I think is incorrect. So I'm going to go ahead now and put the motor mount bolts in, and then we'll go ahead and button up the rest of the engine. Of course, I've got to reattach the clutch cable here, remount the carburetor, reconnect the brake, linkage back here, air cleaner housing, etc., etc. And of course, the biggest item on this side anyway will be the exhaust system, and eventually I'll have to put the chain on the other side. The chain is soaking right now in my parts cleaning tank because it's kind of grubby, so I'm just going to leave it in there for a few days. There's no rush on getting the chain done. I'll let it soak, then I'll brush it down and let it drip dry outside in the sun, and then relubricate it, and I'll put that on probably a bit later. Now, I'm not going to show all the reassembly of everything. I didn't show the disassembly. It's quite academic, quite straightforward. I'm going to do most of that off camera. You will see me here in just a moment put the motor mount bolts back in, but beyond that, most of the reattachment of the various pieces I will be doing off camera. So I'm going to go ahead and move around to the other side of the bike, and we're going to start with the top motor mount bolt. Right down here is the bottom motor mount bolt, and again I'm going to push this bolt through from this side. And I might have to finesse this motor a little bit, make this fit. There. Now it's just a matter of putting the nuts on. On this side, this doesn't have a nut per se because the exhaust system attaches to this bolt right here with a union type connector, so there will be no nut in the classical sense here. But on the opposite side of this bolt right here in the bottom, I've got these washers and nuts that I'll go ahead and put on. So I'm going to stop this at this point in the video, and we'll pick it up a little bit. I thought I'd give you an update where we're at right now. I have everything reassembled in terms of the engine being remounted in the frame, and everything's hooked up. So the motor's back in place, the exhaust system, the engine protector right here, brake's been hooked up, clutch cable's been reconnected, air cleaner. I did put that new air cleaner clamp on right there that I talked about I think earlier that was missing. I also added the two little plugs or buttons right there and there in the frame that fills those threaded inserts for that handle that was not used on this model. Those fit a little loose. I was a little surprised. Those were the part numbers that Honda specified, so my guess is that's not the original style. It's probably a current part that they decided would work in this application. They were a little loose, so what I did is I just used a little contact cement and adhesive to essentially glue them in. They're not going to come out, and if I ever need to get them out using contact cement, they'll be pretty easy to remove. But in the meantime, it's quite sufficient for what I need. So I got those installed. A couple other comments. There's quite a few of the bolts, the Honda bolts. For instance, for the kickstart here, the shift lever on the other side, the air cleaner bolt, attaching bolt at the top, that were metric but were not OEM Honda. And I could tell that by the embossing on the bolt head. Honda used, at least in this era, they used a fairly unique fastener or bolt that was marked, seemed to be unique to Honda. And I don't know if they still use those unique fasteners today, because I don't work on modern equipment, but I could tell that they were not original Honda. So I went through my inventory, because I hang on to all my old nuts, bolts, and screws, washers, if they're still serviceable, and found everything I needed to replace with Honda, original Honda bolts, to replace all those incorrect fasteners. And there was probably 4 or 5 of them, maybe even 6 of them that I had to replace. And I checked the parts diagrams. I found the right sizes and length. They're all 6mm. There's a couple of washers, lock washers and flat washers also I had to replace that were actually missing. But I replaced all that hardware with original OEM Honda. They have the appropriate patina that matched the rest of the bike, so they won't look out of place. So I've got that pretty well done. I'm going to zoom in here on the ignition coil, high tension lead, because after all, that's why we went through all this work to pull the engine out, to replace that high tension lead, and we'll take a little bit closer look at it. I did test the spark. It has good hot spark, and I'll show you that as well. There's the new ignition lead right there, coming out of the frame, going down underneath here. I know you can't see all that. It's behind the muffler, and comes up here. I did line that or sleeve that with a heat shrink tubing where the original vinyl tubing was short, and then captured it in a clamp down here, and then you can see here the new NGK supplied cap that I put on it as part of that kit. So let's go ahead and I'll show you the ignition spark. Ground that out for you and see if you can see that. So watch right here. You should be able to see a good hot blue spark. At least I hope you can see that. So our mission to repair the ignition coil with a new spark plug, more OEM original. That is not obviously an original cap. That's a NGK cap. And I could replace that with a Honda cap, which is still original, but I'm not going to right now. This seems to work fine. So I think we're all back in business in terms of the ignition system. And this side of the bike, I think, is pretty well complete. Let's move over here to the seat, underneath the seat a second, and then we'll go to the other side of the bike. New batteries installed. I checked all the wiring over. Everything's in good condition. There's really no chafing or damage to it. And I blew this out and cleaned this up a little bit. I did talk about some of the hardware that was incorrect. One of the places was here on these bolts that hold this battery tray in place on one side. I think it was the other side. Had some incorrect, in fact the bolt and the washers were all incorrect. One thing that's confused me a little bit is right here, and let me see if I can get a better shot of that. This little plastic tab right here, I don't know what that's for, and there's a hole on both sides that looks like it's supposed to capture this little plastic tab, and clearly it's broke off. I don't know what that's for, this piece. I looked on the parts diagrams, I looked at the frame, I looked at the seat assembly, I looked at electrical, I looked at everything I could think of, and I don't know what that's for. There's rubber pads bumpers that fit in the bottom of the seat that rest right here, and those are there. Those are in the seat. So if anybody out there knows what these are for, or what this is a remnant of, I'd appreciate knowing, because I can't find that part on the parts diagrams. Let's move around to the other side. I just want to give you a shot of the left side of the bike. Again, everything's back in place. I did clean thoroughly the chain. Wire brushed it, soaked it in my parts cleaning tank for probably close to a week. Let it dry, then I re-lubed it and put it back in place. That's a DID or DID chain. That's a Japanese. It's a good brand, very good brand of chain. When I put my chains on, I typically put them on and adjust them a little bit on the tight side, because as you initially will ride it, the machine, usually the chain will loosen up a little bit. So on a rider, I tend to tighten the chain a little bit more than I normally would on a restoration. A restoration is going to sit and is not going to be used. I don't want to put a lot of tension on the bearings, on the countershaft sprocket under here. But if it's going to be a rider, I know it's going to loosen up a little bit. So that chain is just a touch on the tight side intentionally. Again, everything's been cleaned and put back in place. The shift lever right here, I typically like my shift levers a little bit on the low side. That one might be, as I get it off, eventually off the stand and ride it, might prove to be a little too low, I don't know. But I can easily change that. But I typically don't like my shift levers flush with the foot peg. I like them down a little bit. So I'll move that later if I have to. And everything else is pretty much back in place. You'll note right here I don't have the little wire clamps on the fuel lines coming from the fuel tank, which is up underneath here. The reason being is the fuel shutoff is at the carburetor on this machine, and there's fuel in these lines. So if I pull these lines off to put the clamps on, I'm going to end up with fuel all over. So I'm going to wait till probably this fall when I drain the bike and drain the fuel out of it. At that point, then I'll pull the fuel lines and put the new wire clamps on. I do have them. In my inventory, I did order new ones, and I have them available, but that's why you don't see the clamps on here. Other than that, I think everything else is back in place and ready to go at this point, on this side anyway. I think our next steps are going to be to move the headlight shell, and what I'm going to do there is reinstall, or install rather, that new headlight shell that I've been talking about. Right here. I got to take this all apart. I'm going to check the wiring over. I peeked in there one time, but I really haven't done anything in there, so that'll be the next step. Let's get this done, and then we'll move to the taillight, put the new lens on, and then I think we're going to be done with this phase of working on it. I've opened up the headlight shell, and I thought I would share with you what I've discovered. The wiring looks to be very much intact. I don't see really anything at initial blush anyway that looks really out of place, very typical for its age. But what I did run into, or what I discovered, is that someone has been doing some backyard mechanicking on this, and you see this right here, I think, this little washer. That's not original. Someone welded that onto this tab. Now this ring, this chrome ring, has an L-shaped lip that sits something like that, or supposed to, right here. In fact, the lip is still there. And that's supposed to catch a little flange here on the underside of this shell. And if we take a look at the new piece, and this is the new, let me get this in focus for you here, the new shell, I think you can probably see that lip, or that protrusion right here, that bracket is supposed to capture. So you're supposed to put it in like this, and then a screw at the bottom holds the assembly in place. And I think what probably happened is, when this was damaged years ago, and you can see someone started to fiberglass it, that tab underneath here got broken off that that's supposed to engage with. So they were creative, I give them credit. They took a big flat washer, welded it on, drilled a hole, and this fits in like this, and they just had a screw that went down through and held it in place. So it worked, but it's not correct, of course. So what I'm going to do is take this apart, and I have to anyway to put the new shell in place. And I'm going to try to carefully cut this off. And for now anyway, I'm going to preserve this chrome ring. Eventually this will probably be replaced, but since that tab is still on there, and I think I can probably salvage it, I can cut it off and then maybe file it back, clean up some of the weld, and I can get this to re-engage with the new headlight shell. Then it's simply a matter of just pulling the wiring out, removing the spinometer, fishing everything back in place, and remounting it. That's my thinking right now. I'm not going to show all that, but I will, again, as usual, I'll update you from time to time. It's a little while later, and you can see I cut the washer off. Remember, it was welded on, something like that, and I just clamped this ring assembly in my soft jaws and my bench vise, took a cutoff wheel and a Dremel tool and just cut it off, and ground it back just a little bit, as you can see. I am going to go ahead and replace this rim. You can, I can buy this whole assembly with the light and the rim for like $23. It's not OEM Honda. Actually, Honda does not support this part anymore, I don't believe, but I think it'll be perfectly fine for this project. It does fit, as you can see there, something like that. It'll fit in there for now. So I'm going to go ahead and put this assembly back together, reconnect the wiring. You can see I've got everything in here done. Got the speedometer remounted. That was very easy to do. It went together really smoothly. And it's all clamped back into place. The speedometer cable's hooked up inside, and we're ready to go. So just a matter of remounting this temporarily, this headlight, until we can replace this. I'll go ahead and order one, probably be a week or so before I get it back. So I'm going to assemble this headlight, and then we're going to go with the tail light, and I'll put a new lens on that tail light assembly, make sure that's all. Much can be simpler than replacing this tail light lens. New screws as well. I replaced the bulb a while back with a new dual filament 6-volt bulb, which is correct for this application. I left the original gasket in place because it was in good shape, so I didn't see any need to replace it. So now we'll just finesse this lens cover into position, make sure it's seated, and then install the new screws. Now when you tighten these screws down, you don't want to overdo it because you'll crack the plastic around the screw hole. You just want to just snug them up a little bit. Let's now go ahead and test the brake light and see how it works. And we've got brake light. One thing I did fail to mention a moment ago is I did replace this cap nut here on the end of this bolt that goes through the air cleaner assembly with a new Honda part. So I think that's going to be it for this short series, folks, on reconditioning this 1971 Honda CT70 Mini Trail H model manual clutch. We replaced the tubes in both tires, put a new high tension lead on the coil along with a new spark plug cap, new cap nut on the end of the air cleaner housing there, right there. Replaced the taillight lens, also replaced the headlight shell, though I've got to get a new ring for it yet. I'll come back to that. I probably won't show that, I'll just go ahead and replace it. Next time I get around to ordering some parts, I'm going to order that new ring. But it is back together now and it's functional. The exhaust system I'm going to come back to at another time. It's going to be an expensive proposition because essentially the whole thing has to be replaced. And I have some other projects I'd like to work on at this point instead of spending the money on that exhaust system for just a around-the-yard rider. I am going to replace the control levers. I got to get a hold of Pete on those yet. I have not done that as of this recording, but that's on my list to get a hold of Pete. See if I can track those down from him. Other than that, I think we've done what we set out to do except for the exhaust system. Any issues, questions, thoughts, drop me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching.